But in the morning, he was uneasy again. She was still foreign and unknown to him. Only, within the fear was pride, belief in himself as mate for her. And she, everything forgotten in her new hour of coming to life, radiated vigor and joy so that he quivered to touch her. It made a great difference to him. Marriage. Things became so remote and of so little significance as he knew the powerful source of his life. His eyes opened on a new universe, and he wondered in thinking of his triviality before. A new, calm relationship showed to him in the things he saw, in the cattle he used, the young wheat as it eddied in a wind. And each time he returned home, he went steadily, expectantly, like a man who goes to a profound, unknown satisfaction. At dinner time, he appeared in the doorway, hanging back a moment from entering, to see if she was there. He saw her setting the plates on the white-scrubbed table. Her arms were slim. She had a slim body and full skirts. She had a dark, shapely head with close-banded hair. Somehow it was her head, so shapely and poignant, that revealed her as woman to him. As she moved about clothed closely, full-skirted and wearing her little silk apron, her dark hair smoothly parted, her head revealed itself to him in all its subtle, intrinsic beauty, and he knew she was his woman. He knew her essence, that it was his to possess. And he seemed to live thus in contact with her, in contact with the unknown, the unaccountable and incalculable. They did not take much notice of each other, consciously. "I'm betimes," he said. "Yes," she answered. He turned to the dogs, or to the child if she was there. The little Anna played about the farm, flitting constantly in to call something to her mother, to fling her arms round her mother's skirts, to be noticed, perhaps caressed, then, forgetting, to slip out again. Then Brangwen, talking to the child or to the dog between his knees, would be aware of his wife, as, in her tight, dark bodice and her lace fichu, she was reaching up to the corner cupboard. He realized with a sharp pang that she belonged to him, and he to her. He realized that he lived by her. Did he own her? Was she here forever? Or might she go away? She was not really his. It was not a real marriage, this marriage between them. She might go away. He did not feel like a master, husband, father of her children. She belonged elsewhere. Any moment, she might be gone. And he was ever drawn to her, drawn after her, with ever-raging, ever-unsatisfied desire. He must always turn home, wherever his steps were taking him, always to her, and he could never quite reach her. He could never quite be satisfied, never be at peace, because she might go away. At evening, he was glad. Then, when he had finished in the yard and come in and washed himself, when the child was put to bed, he could sit on the other side of the fire with his beer on the hob and his long white pipe in his fingers, conscious of her there opposite him, as she worked at her embroidery, or as she talked to him, and he was safe with her now, till morning. She was curiously self-sufficient, and did not say very much. Occasionally she lifted her head, her gray eyes shining with a strange light that had nothing to do with him or with this place, and would tell him about herself. She seemed to be back again in the past, chiefly in her childhood or her girlhood, with her father. She very rarely talked of her first husband, but sometimes, all shining-eyed, she was back at her own home, telling him about the riotous times, the trip to Paris with her father, tales of the mad acts of the peasants when a burst of religious, self-hurting fervor had passed over the country. She would lift her head and say, "When they brought the railway across the country, they made afterwards smaller railways of shorter width to come down to our town, 100 miles. When I was a girl, Gisela, my German gouvernante, was very shocked, and she would not tell me. But I heard the servants talking. I remember it was Pierre, the coachman, and my father and some of his friends, landowners, they had taken a wagon, a whole railway wagon, that you travel in." "A railway carriage," said Brangwen. She laughed to herself. "I know it was a great scandal. Yes, a whole wagon, and they had girls, Fias, naked, all the wagon full, and so they came down to our village. They came through villages of the Jews, and it was a great scandal. Can you imagine? All the countryside. And my mother, she did not like it. Gisela said to me, 'Madam, she must not know that you have heard such things.' My mother, she used to cry, and she wished to beat my father, plainly beat him. He would say, when she cried because he sold the forest, the wood, to jingle money in his pocket and go to Warsaw or Paris or Kiev, when she said he must take back his word. He must not sell the forest, he would stand and say, I know, I have heard it all, I have heard it all before.
Tell me some new thing.
I know. Oh, but can you understand? I loved him when he stood there under the door, saying only, I know it all already. She could not change him. No, not if she killed herself for it. And she could change everybody else, but him, she could not change him. Brangwen could not understand. He had pictures of a cattle truck full of naked girls riding from nowhere to nowhere, of Lydia laughing because her father made great debts and said, I know, of Jews running down the street shouting in Yiddish, don't do it, and being cut down by demented peasants. She called them cattle, whilst she looked on interested and even amused, of tutors and governesses and Paris and a convent. It was too much for him. And there she sat, telling the tales to the open space, not to him, arrogating a curious superiority to him, a distance between them, something strange and foreign and outside his life, talking, rattling, without rhyme or reason, laughing when he was shocked or astounded, condemning nothing, confounding his mind and making the whole world a chaos, without order or stability of any kind. Then, when they went to bed, he knew that he had nothing to do with her. She was back in her childhood. He was a peasant, a serf, a servant, a lover, a paramour, a shadow, a nothing. He lay still in amazement, staring at the room he knew so well, and wondering whether it was really there, the window, the chest of drawers, or whether it was merely a figment in the atmosphere. And gradually he grew into a raging fury against her. But because he was so much amazed, and there was as yet such a distance between them, and she was such an amazing thing to him, with all wonder opening out behind her, he made no retaliation on her. Only he lay still and wide-eyed with rage, inarticulate, not understanding, but solid with hostility. And he remained wrathful and distinct from her, unchanged outwardly to her, but underneath a solid power of antagonism to her, of which she became gradually aware, and it irritated her to be made aware of him as a separate power. She lapsed into a sort of somber exclusion, a curious communion with mysterious powers, a sort of mystic, dark state which drove him and the child nearly mad. He walked about for days stiffened with resistance to her, stiff with a will to destroy her as she was. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, there was connection between them again. It came on him as he was working in the fields. The tension, the bond, burst, and the passionate flood broke forward into a tremendous, magnificent rush, so that he felt he could snap off the trees as he passed and create the world afresh. And when he arrived home, there was no sign between them. He waited and waited till she came. And as he waited, his limbs seemed strong and splendid to him. His hands seemed like passionate servants to him. Goodly, he felt a stupendous power in himself, of life and of urgent, strong blood. She was sure to come at last and touch him. Then he burst into flame for her and lost himself. They looked at each other, a deep laugh at the bottom of their eyes, and he went to take of her again, wholesale, mad to revel in the inexhaustible wealth of her, to bury himself in the depths of her in an inexhaustible exploration, she all the while reveling in that he reveled in her, tossed all her secrets aside and plunged to that which was secret to her as well, whilst she quivered with fear and the last anguish of delight. What did it matter who they were, whether they knew each other or not? The hour passed away again. There was severance between them, and rage and misery and bereavement for her, and deposition and toiling at the mill with slaves for him. But no matter. They had had their hour, and should it chime again, they were ready for it, ready to renew the game at the point where it was left off, on the edge of the outer darkness, when the secrets within the woman are game for the man, hunted doggedly, when the secrets of the woman are the man's adventure, and they both give themselves to the adventure. She was with child, and there was again the silence and distance between them. She did not want him nor his secrets nor his game. He was deposed. He was cast out. He seethed with fury at the small, ugly-mouthed woman who had nothing to do with him. Sometimes his anger broke on her, but she did not cry. She turned on him like a tiger, and there was battle. He had to learn to contain himself again, and he hated it. He hated her, that she was not there for him, and he took himself off anywhere. But an instinct of gratitude and a knowledge that she would receive him back again, that later on she would be there for him again, prevented his straying very far. He cautiously did not go too far. He knew she might lapse into ignorance of him, lapse away from him, farther, 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 till she was lost to him. He had sense enough, premonition enough in himself, to be aware of this and to measure himself accordingly. For he did not want to lose her. He did not want her to lapse away. Cold, he called her selfish, only caring about herself, a foreigner with a bad nature, caring really about nothing, having no proper feelings at the bottom of her and no proper niceness. He raged and piled up accusations that had some measure of truth in them all. But a certain grace in him forbade him from going too far. He knew, and he quivered with rage and hatred, that she was all these vile things, that she was everything vile and detestable. But he had grace at the bottom of him, which told him that, above all things, he did not want to lose her. He was not going to lose her. So he kept some consideration for her. He preserved some relationship. He went out more often, to the Red Lion again, to escape the madness of sitting next to her when she did not belong to him, when she was as absent as any woman in indifference could be. He could not stay at home. So he went to the Red Lion, and sometimes he got drunk, but he preserved his measure. Some things between them he never forfeited. A tormented look came into his eyes, as if something were always dogging him. He glanced sharp and quick. He could not bear to sit still doing nothing. He had to go out, to find company, to give himself away there. For he had no other outlet. He could not work to give himself out. He had not the knowledge. As the months of her pregnancy went on, she left him more and more alone. She was more and more unaware of him. His existence was annulled. And he felt bound down, bound, unable to stir, beginning to go mad, ready to rave. For she was quiet and polite, as if he did not exist, as one is quiet and polite to a servant. Nevertheless, she was great with his child. It was his turn to submit. She sat opposite him, sewing, her foreign face inscrutable and indifferent. He felt he wanted to break her into acknowledgement of him, into awareness of him. It was insufferable that she had so obliterated him. He would smash her into regarding him. He had a raging agony of desire to do so. But something bigger in him withheld him, kept him motionless. So he went out of the house for relief. Or he turned to the little girl for her sympathy and her love. He appealed with all his power to the small Anna. So soon they were like lovers, father and child. For he was afraid of his wife. As she sat there with bent head, silent, working or reading, but so unutterably silent that his heart seemed under the millstone of it, she became herself like the upper millstone lying on him, crushing him, as sometimes a heavy sky lies on the earth. Yet he knew he could not tear her away from the heavy obscurity into which she was merged. He must not try to tear her into recognition of himself and agreement with himself. It were disastrous, impious. So, let him rage as he might, he must withhold himself. But his wrists trembled and seemed mad, seemed as if they would burst. When in November, the leaves came beating against the window shutters, with a lashing sound, he started, and his eyes flickered with flame. The dog looked up at him. He sunk his head to the fire, but his wife was startled. He was aware of her listening. "They blow up with a rattle," he said. "What?" she asked. "The leaves." She sank away again. The strange leaves beating in the wind on the wood had come nearer than she. The tension in the room was overpowering. It was difficult for him to move his head. He sat with every nerve, every vein, every fiber of muscle in his body stretched on attention. He felt like a broken arch thrust sickeningly out from support. For her response was gone. He thrust at nothing. And he remained himself. He saved himself from crashing down into nothingness, from being squandered into fragments by sheer tension, sheer backward resistance. During the last months of her pregnancy, he went about in a surcharged, imminent state that did not exhaust itself. She was also depressed, and sometimes she cried. It needed so much life to begin afresh after she had lost so lavishly. Sometimes she cried. Then he stood stiff, feeling his heart would burst. For she did not want him. She did not want even to be made aware of him. By the very puckering of her face, he knew that he must stand back, leave her intact, alone. For it was the old grief come back in her, the old loss, the pain of the old life, the dead husband, the dead children. This was sacred to her, and he must not violate her with his comfort. For what she wanted, she would come to him. He stood aloof with turgid heart. He had to see her tears fall over her scarcely moving face, that only puckered sometimes, down onto her breast, that was so still, scarcely moving. And there was no noise, save now and again, when, with a strange, somnambulant movement, she took her handkerchief and wiped her face and blew her nose, and went on with the noiseless weeping. He knew that any offer of comfort from himself would be worse than useless, hateful to her, jangling her. She must cry, but it drove him insane. His heart was scalded, his brain hurt in his head. He went away, out of the house. His great and chiefest source of solace was the child. She had been at first aloof from him, reserved. However friendly she might seem one day, the next she would have lapsed to her original disregard of him, cold, detached, at her distance. The first morning after his marriage, he had discovered it would not be so easy with the child. At the break of dawn, he had started awake, hearing a small voice outside the door saying plaintively, "Mother." He rose and opened the door. She stood on the threshold in her nightdress, as she had climbed out of bed, black eyes staring round and hostile, her fair hair sticking out in a wild fleece. The man and child confronted each other. "I want my mother," she said, jealously accenting the "my." "Come on then," he said gently. "Where's my mother?" "She's here, come on." The child's eyes, staring at the man with ruffled hair and beard, did not change. The mother's voice called softly. The little bare feet entered the room with trepidation. "Mother." "Come, my dear." The small bare feet approached swiftly. "I wondered where you were," came the plaintive voice. The mother stretched out her arms. The child stood beside the high bed. Brangwen lightly lifted the tiny girl with an up-a-daisy, then took his own place in the bed again. "Mother," cried the child, as in anguish. "What, my pet?" Anna wriggled close into her mother's arms, clinging tight, hiding from the fact of the man. Brangwen lay still and waited. There was a long silence. Then suddenly, Anna looked round, as if she thought he would be gone. She saw the face of the man lying upturned to the ceiling. Her black eyes stared antagonistic from her exquisite face. Her arms clung tightly to her mother, afraid. He did not move for some time, not knowing what to say. His face was smooth and soft-skinned with love, his eyes full of soft light. He looked at her, scarcely moving his head, his eyes smiling. "Have you just wakened up?" he said. "Go away," she retorted, with a little darting forward of the head, something like a viper. "Nay," he answered. "I'm not going. You can go." "Go away," came the sharp little command. "There's room for you," he said. "You can't send your father from his own bed, my little bird," said her mother pleasantly. The child glowered at him, miserable in her impotence. "There's room for you as well," he said. "It's a big bed enough." She glowered without answering, then turned and clung to her mother. She would not allow it. During the day, she asked her mother several times, "When are we going home, Mother?" "We're at home, darling. We live here now. This is our house. We live here with your father." The child was forced to accept it, but she remained against the man. As night came on, she asked, "Where are you going to sleep, Mother?" "I sleep with the father now." And when Brangwen came in, the child asked fiercely, "Why do you sleep with my mother?" "My mother sleeps with me," her voice quivering. "You come as well, and sleep with both of us," he coaxed. "Mother," she cried, turning, appealing against him. "But I must have a husband, darling. All women must have a husband." And you like to have a father with your mother, don't you? Said Brangwen. Anna glowered at him. She seemed to cogitate. No, she cried fiercely at length. No, I don't want. And slowly her face puckered. She sobbed bitterly. He stood and watched her, sorry. But there could be no altering it. Which, when she knew, she became quiet. He was easy with her, talking to her, taking her to see the live creatures, bringing her the first chickens in his cap, taking her to gather the eggs, letting her throw crusts to the horse. She would easily accompany him and take all he had to give, but she remained neutral still. She was curiously, incomprehensibly jealous of her mother, always anxiously concerned about her. If Brangwen drove with his wife to Nottingham, Anna ran about happily enough, or unconcerned, for a long time. Then, as afternoon came on, there was only one cry. I want my mother, I want my mother. And a bitter, pathetic sobbing that soon had the soft-hearted Tilly sobbing too. The child's anguish was that her mother was gone. Yet as a rule, Anna seemed cold, resenting her mother, critical of her. It was, I don't like you to do that, mother. Or, I don't like you to say that. She was a sore problem to Brangwen and to all the people at the marsh. As a rule, however, she was active, lightly flitting about the farmyard, only appearing now and again to assure herself of her mother. Happy she never seemed, but quick, sharp, absorbed, full of imagination and changeability. Tilly said she was bewitched, but it did not matter so long as she did not cry. There was something heartrending about Anna's crying. Her childish anguish seemed so utter and so timeless, as if it were a thing of all the ages. She made playmates of the creatures of the farmyard, talking to them, telling them the stories she had from her mother, counseling them and correcting them. Brangwen found her at the gate leading to the paddock and to the duck pond. She was peering through the bars and shouting to the stately white geese that stood in a curving line. You're not to call at people when they want to come. You must not do it. The heavy, balanced birds looked at the fierce little face and the fleece of keen hair thrust between the bars, and they raised their heads and swayed off, producing the long, kankanking, protesting noise of geese, rocking their ship-like, beautiful white bodies in a line beyond the gate. You're naughty, cried Anna, tears of dismay and vexation in her eyes. And she stamped her slipper. Why? What are they doing? Said Brangwen. They won't let me come in, she said, turning her flushed little face to him. They will. You can go in if you want to. And he pushed open the gate for her. She stood irresolute, looking at the group of bluey-white geese standing monumental under the gray, cold day. Go on, he said. She marched valiantly a few steps in. Her little body started convulsively at the sudden, derisive kankank of the geese. A blankness spread over her. The geese trailed away with uplifted heads under the low gray sky. They don't know you, said Brangwen. You should tell them what your name is. They're naughty to shout at me, she flashed. They think you don't live here, he said. Later he found her at the gate calling shrilly and imperiously. My name is Anna Lenski, and I live here because Mr. Brangwen's my father now. He is, yes he is. And I live here. This pleased Brangwen very much. And gradually, without knowing it herself, she clung to him in her lost, childish, desolate moments when it was good to creep up to something big and warm and bury her little self in his big, unlimited being. Instinctively, he was careful of her, careful to recognize her and to give himself to her disposal. She was difficult of her affections. For Tilly, she had a childish, essential contempt, almost dislike, because the poor woman was such a servant. The child would not let the serving woman attend to her, do intimate things for her, not for a long time. She treated her as one of an inferior race. Brangwen did not like it. Why aren't you fond of Tilly? He asked. Because she looks at me with her eyes bent. Then gradually she accepted Tilly as belonging to the household, never as a person. For the first weeks, the black eyes of the child were forever on the watch. Brangwen, good-humored but impatient, spoiled by Tilly, was an easy blusterer. If for a few minutes he upset the household with his noisy impatience, He found at the end the child glowering at him with intense black eyes, and she was sure to dart forward her little head, like a serpent, with her biting. "Go away." "I'm not going away," he shouted, irritated at last. "Go yourself, hustle, stir thy son, hop." And he pointed to the door. The child backed away from him, pale with fear. Then she gathered up courage, seeing him become patient. "We don't live with you," she said, thrusting forward her little head at him. You're abominable." "A what?" he shouted. Her voice wavered, but it came. "Abominable." And you're comical." She meditated. Then she hissed forwards her head. "I'm not." "Not what?" "A comical." "No more am I a abominable." He was really cross. Other times she would say, "My mother doesn't live here." "Oh, I want her to go away." "Then wants your portion," he replied laconically. So they drew nearer together. He would take her with him when he went out in the trap. The horse ready at the gate, he came noisily into the house, which seemed quiet and peaceful till he appeared to set everything awake. "Now then, Topsy, pop into thy bonnet." The child drew herself up, resenting the indignity of the address. "I can't fasten my bonnet myself," she said haughtily. "Not man enough yet," he said, tying the ribbons under her chin with clumsy fingers. She held up her face to him. Her little bright red lips moved as he fumbled under her chin. "You talk nonsense," she said, re-echoing one of his phrases. "That face shouts for dich pump," he said, and taking out a big red handkerchief that smelled of strong tobacco, began wiping round her mouth. "Is Kitty waiting for me?" she asked. "Aye," he said. "Let's finish wiping your face. It'll pass, why, a catlick." She submitted prettily. Then, when he let her go, she began to skip, with a curious flicking up of one leg behind her. "Now, my young buck rabbit," he said. "Slippy." She came and was shaken into her coat, and the two set off. She sat very close beside him in the gig, tucked tightly, feeling his big body sway against her, very splendid. She loved the rocking of the gig, when his big, live body swayed upon her, against her. She laughed, a poignant little shrill laugh, and her black eyes glowed. She was curiously hard, and then passionately tender-hearted. Her mother was ill. The child stole about on tiptoe in the bedroom for hours, being nurse, and doing the thing thoughtfully and diligently. Another day, her mother was unhappy. Anna would stand with her legs apart, glowering, balancing on the sides of her slippers. She laughed when the goslings wriggled in Tilly's hand. As the pellets of food were rammed down their throats with a skewer, she laughed nervously. She was hard and imperious with the animals, squandering no love, running about amongst them like a cruel mistress. Summer came, and hay harvest. Anna was a brown elfish mite dancing about. Tilly always marveled over her, more than she loved her. But always in the child was some anxious connection with the mother. So long as Mrs. Brangwen was all right, the little girl played about and took very little notice of her. But corn harvest went by, the autumn drew on, and the mother, the later months of her pregnancy beginning, was strange and detached. Brangwen began to knit his brows. The old, unhealthy uneasiness, the unskinned susceptibility came on the child again. If she went to the fields with her father, then, instead of playing about carelessly, it was, "I want to go home." "Home? Why this knob at this minute come?" "I want to go home." "What for? What ails thee?" "I want my mother." "Thy mother? Thy mother none wants thee." "I want to go home." There would be tears in a moment. "Can ter find Tirode then?" And he watched her scudding, silent and intent, along the hedge bottom at a steady, anxious pace, till she turned and was gone through the gateway. Then he saw her 2 fields off, still pressing forward, small and urgent. His face was clouded as he turned to plow up the stubble. The year drew on. In the hedges the berries shone red and twinkling above bare twigs. Robins were seen. Great droves of birds dashed like spray from the fallow. Rooks appeared, black and flapping down to earth. The ground was cold as he pulled the turnips. The roads were churned deep in mud. Then the turnips were pitted, and work was slack. Inside the house it was dark and quiet. The child flitted uneasily round, and now and again came her plaintive, startled cry, "Mother!" Mrs. Brangwen was heavy and unresponsive. Tired, lapsed back. Brangwen went on working out of doors. At evening, when he came in to milk, the child would run behind him. Then, in the cozy cowsheets, with the door shut and the air looking warm by the light of the hanging lantern, above the branching horns of the cows, she would stand watching his hands squeezing rhythmically the teats of the placid beast, watch the froth and the leaping squirt of milk, watch his hand sometimes rubbing slowly, understandingly, upon a hanging udder. So they kept each other company, but at a distance, rarely speaking. The darkest days of the year came on. The child was fretful, sighing as if some oppression were on her, running hither and thither without relief. And Brangwen went about at his work, heavy, his heart heavy as the sodden earth. The winter nights fell early. The lamp was lighted before tea time. The shutters were closed. They were all shut into the room with the tension and stress. Mrs. Brangwen went early to bed, Anna playing on the floor beside her. Brangwen sat in the emptiness of the downstairs room, smoking, scarcely conscious even of his own misery. And very often he went out to escape it. Christmas passed. The wet, drenched, cold days of January recurred monotonously, with now and then a brilliance of blue flashing in, when Brangwen went out into a morning like crystal, when every sound rang again, and the birds were many and sudden and brusque in the hedges. Then an elation came over him in spite of everything, whether his wife were strange or sad, or whether he craved for her to be with him. It did not matter. The air rang with clear noises. The sky was like crystal, like a bell, and the earth was hard. Then he worked and was happy, his eyes shining, his cheeks flushed, and the zest of life was strong in him. The birds pecked busily round him. The horses were fresh and ready. The bare branches of the trees flung themselves up like a man yawning, taut with energy. The twigs radiated off into the clear light. He was alive and full of zest for it all. And if his wife were heavy, separated from him, extinguished, then let her be, let him remain himself. Things would be as they would be. Meanwhile, he heard the ringing crow of a cockerel in the distance. He saw the pale shell of the moon effaced on a blue sky. So he shouted to the horses and was happy. If, driving into Ilkeston, a fresh young woman were going in to do her shopping, he hailed her and reined in his horse and picked her up. Then he was glad to have her near him. His eyes shone, his voice, laughing, teasing in a warm fashion, made the poise of her head more beautiful. Her blood ran quicker. They were both stimulated. The morning was fine. What did it matter that, at the bottom of his heart, was care and pain? It was at the bottom. Let it stop at the bottom. His wife, her suffering, her coming pain. Well, it must be so. She suffered, but he was out of doors, full in life, and it would be ridiculous, indecent, to pull a long face and to insist on being miserable. He was happy, this morning, driving to town, with the hoofs of the horse spanking the hard earth. Well, he was happy, if half the world were weeping at the funeral of the other half. And it was a jolly girl sitting beside him. And woman was immortal, whatever happened, whoever turned towards death. Let the misery come when it could not be resisted. The evening arrived later, very beautiful, with a rosy flush hovering above the sunset, and passing away into violet and lavender, with turquoise green north and south in the sky, and in the east, a great, yellow moon hanging heavy and radiant. It was magnificent to walk between the sunset and the moon, on a road where little holly trees thrust black into the rose and lavender, and starlings flickered in droves across the light. But what was the end of the journey? The pain came right enough later on, when his heart and his feet were heavy, his brain dead, his life stopped. One afternoon, the pains began. Mrs. Brangwen was put to bed. Sometimes there sounded, long and remote in the house, vibrating through everything, the moaning cry of a woman in labor. Brangwen, sitting downstairs, was divided. His lower, deeper self was with her, bound to her, suffering. But the big shell of his body remembered the sound of owls that used to fly round the farmstead when he was a boy. He was back in his youth, a boy, haunted by the sound of the owls, waking up his brother to speak to him. And his mind drifted away to the birds, their solemn, dignified faces, their flight so soft and broad-winged. And then to the birds his brother had shot, fluffy, dust-colored, dead heaps of softness with faces absurdly asleep. It was a queer thing, a dead owl. He lifted his cup to his lips. He watched the child with the beads. But his mind was occupied with owls and the atmosphere of his boyhood, with his brothers and sisters. Elsewhere, fundamental, he was with his wife in labor. The child was being brought forth out of their one flesh. He and she, one flesh, out of which life must be put forth. The rent was not in his body, but it was of his body. On her the blows fell, but the quiver ran through to him, to his last fiber. She must be torn asunder for life to come forth, yet still they were one flesh, and still, from further back, the life came out of him to her, and still he was the unbroken that has the broken rock in its arms. Their flesh was one rock from which the life gushed, out of her who was smitten and rent, from him who quivered and yielded. He went upstairs to her. As he came to the bedside, she spoke to him in Polish. "Is it very bad?" he asked. She looked at him, and oh, the weariness to her of the effort to understand another language, the weariness of hearing him, attending to him, making out who he was as he stood there fair-bearded and alien, looking at her. She knew something of him, of his eyes, but she could not grasp him. She closed her eyes. He turned away, white to the gills. "It's not so very bad," said the midwife. He knew he was a strain on his wife. He went downstairs. The child glanced up at him, frightened. "I want my mother," she quavered. But she's badly," he said mildly, unheeding. She looked at him with lost, frightened eyes. "Has she got a headache?" "No, she's going to have a baby." The child looked round. He was unaware of her. She was alone again in terror. "I want my mother," came the cry of panic. "Let Tilly undress you," he said. "You're tired." There was another silence. Again came the cry of labor. "I want my mother," rang automatically from the wincing, panic-stricken child that felt cut off and lost in a horror of desolation. Tilly came forward, her heart wrung. "Come, then let me undress her then. Pet lamb," she crooned. "You s'll have your mother in mornin'. Don't you fret, my ducky." "Never mind, angel." But Anna stood upon the sofa, her back to the wall. "I want my mother," she cried, her little face quivering and the great tears of childish, utter anguish falling. "She's poorly, my lamb. She's poorly tonight, but she'll be better by mornin'." "Oh, don't cry, love. She doesn't want you to cry, precious little heart. No, she doesn't." Tilly took gently hold of the child's skirts. Anna snatched back her dress and cried, in a little hysteria, "No, you're not to undress me. I want my mother." And her child's face was running with grief and tears, her body shaken. "Oh, but let Tilly undress you. Let Tilly undress you, who loves you. Don't be willful tonight. Mother's poorly. She doesn't want you to cry." The child sobbed distractedly. She could not hear. "I want my mother," she wept. "When you're undressed, you s'll go up to see your mother. When you're undressed, pet. When you've let Tilly undress you. When you're a little jewel in your nightie, love. Oh, don't you cry, don't you." Brangwen sat stiff in his chair. He felt his brain going tighter. He crossed over the room, aware only of the maddening sobbing. "Don't make a noise," he said. And a new fear shook the child from the sound of his voice. She cried mechanically, her eyes looking watchful through her tears, in terror, alert to what might happen. "I want my mother," quavered the sobbing, blind voice. A shiver of irritation went over the man's limbs. It was the utter, persistent unreason, the maddening blindness of the voice and the crying. "You must come and be undressed," he said, in a quiet voice that was thin with anger. and he reached his hand and grasped her. He felt her body catch in a convulsive sob. But he too was blind and intent, irritated into mechanical action. He began to unfasten her little apron. She would have shrunk from him, but could not. So her small body remained in his grasp, while he fumbled at the little buttons and tapes, unthinking, intent, unaware of anything but the irritation of her. Her body was held taut and resistant. He pushed off the little dress and the petticoats, revealing the white arms. She kept stiff, overpowered, violated. He went on with his task, and all the while she sobbed, choking, "I want my mother." He was unheedingly silent, his face stiff. The child was now incapable of understanding. She had become a little, mechanical thing of fixed will. She wept, her body convulsed, her voice repeating the same cry. Dear Omi," cried Tilly, becoming distracted herself. Brangwen, slow, clumsy, blind, intent, got off all the little garments and stood the child naked in its shift upon the sofa. "Where's her nightie?" he asked. Tilly brought it, and he put it on her. Anna did not move her limbs to his desire. He had to push them into place. She stood, with fixed, blind will, resistant, a small, convulsed, unchangeable thing weeping ever and repeating the same phrase. He lifted one foot after the other, pulled off slippers and socks. She was ready. "Do you want a drink?" he asked. She did not change. Unheeding, uncaring, she stood on the sofa, standing back, alone, her hands shut and half lifted, her face, all tears, raised and blind. And through the sobbing and choking came the broken, "I want my mother." "Do you want a drink?" he said again. There was no answer. He lifted the stiff, denying body between his hands. Its stiff blindness made a flash of rage go through him. He would like to break it. He set the child on his knee and sat again in his chair beside the fire, the wet, sobbing, inarticulate noise going on near his ear, the child sitting stiff, not yielding to him or anything, not aware. A new degree of anger came over him. What did it all matter? What did it matter if the mother talked Polish and cried in labor, if this child were stiff with resistance and crying? Why take it to heart? Let the mother cry in labor, let the child cry in resistance, since they would do so. Why should he fight against it? Why resist? Let it be, if it were so. Let them be as they were, if they insisted. And in a daze he sat, offering no fight. The child cried on. The minutes ticked away, a sort of torpor was on him. It was some little time before he came to and turned to attend to the child. He was shocked by her little wet, blinded face. A bit dazed, he pushed back the wet hair. Like a living statue of grief, her blind face cried on. "Nay," he said, "not as bad as that. It's not as bad as that, Anna, my child. Come, what are you crying for so much? Come, stop now, it'll make you sick. I wipe you dry. Don't wet your face anymore. Don't cry any more wet tears, don't. It's better not to. Don't cry. It's not so bad as all that. Hush now, hush, let it be enough." His voice was queer and distant and calm. He looked at the child. She was beside herself now. He wanted her to stop. He wanted it all to stop, to become natural. "Come," he said, rising to turn away. "We'll go and supper up the beast." He took a big shawl, folded her round, and went out into the kitchen for a lantern. "You're never taking the child out of a night like this," said Tilly. It'll quieten her," he answered. It was raining. The child was suddenly still, shocked, finding the rain on its face, the darkness. "We'll just give the cows there something to eat before they go to bed," Brangwen was saying to her, holding her close and sure. There was a trickling of water into the butt, a burst of raindrops sputtering onto her shawl, and the light of the lantern swinging, flashing on a wet pavement and the base of a wet wall. Otherwise, it was black darkness, one breathed darkness. He opened the doors, upper and lower, and they entered into the high, dry barn that smelled warm even if it were not warm. He hung the lantern on the nail and shut the door. They were in another world now. The light shed softly on the timbered barn, on the whitewashed walls, and the great heap of hay, Instruments cast their shadows largely. A ladder rose to the dark arch of a loft. Outside there was the driving rain. Inside, the softly illuminated stillness and calmness of the barn. Holding the child on one arm, he set about preparing the food for the cows, filling a pan with chopped hay and brewer's grains and a little meal. The child, all wonder, watched what he did. A new being was created in her for the new conditions. Sometimes a little spasm, eddying from the bygone storm of sobbing, shook her small body. Her eyes were wide and wondering, pathetic. She was silent, quite still. In a sort of dream, his heart sunk to the bottom. Leaving the surface of him still, quite still, he rose with the pan full of food, carefully balancing the child on one arm, the pan in the other hand. The silky fringe of the shawl swayed softly, grains and hay trickled to the floor. He went along a dimly lit passage behind the mangers, where the horns of the cows pricked out of the obscurity. The child shrank. He balanced stiffly, rested the pan on the manger wall, and tipped out the food, half to this cow, half to the next. There was a noise of chains running as the cows lifted or dropped their heads sharply, then a contented, soothing sound, a long snuffing as the beasts ate in silence. The journey had to be performed several times. There was the rhythmic sound of the shovel in the barn. Then the man returned walking stiffly between the two weights, the face of the child peering out from the shawl. Then the next time, as he stooped, she freed her arm and put it round his neck, clinging soft and warm, making all easier. The beasts fed. He dropped the pan and sat down on a box to arrange the child. "Will the cows go to sleep now?" she said, catching her breath as she spoke. "Yes." "Will they eat all their stuff up first?" "Yes." "Hark at them." And the two sat still listening to the snuffing and breathing of cows feeding in the sheds communicating with this small barn. The lantern shed a soft, steady light from one wall. All outside was still in the rain. He looked down at the silky folds of the paisley shawl. It reminded him of his mother. She used to go to church in it. He was back again in the old irresponsibility and security, a boy at home. The two sat very quiet. His mind, in a sort of trance, seemed to become more and more vague. He held the child close to him. A quivering little shudder, re-echoing from her sobbing, went down her limbs. He held her closer. Gradually she relaxed. The eyelids began to sink over her dark, watchful eyes. As she sank to sleep, his mind became blank. When he came to, as if from sleep, he seemed to be sitting in a timeless stillness. What was he listening for? He seemed to be listening for some sound a long way off from beyond life. He remembered his wife. He must go back to her. The child was asleep, the eyelids not quite shut, showing a slight film of black pupil between. Why did she not shut her eyes? Her mouth was also a little open. He rose quickly and went back to the house. "Is she asleep?" whispered Tilly. He nodded. The servant woman came to look at the child who slept in the shawl, with cheeks flushed hot and red and a whiteness, a wanness round the eyes. "God a mercy," whispered Tilly, shaking her head. He pushed off his boots and went upstairs with the child. He became aware of the anxiety grasped tight at his heart because of his wife. But he remained still. The house was silent save for the wind outside and the noisy trickling and splattering of water in the water butts. There was a slit of light under his wife's door. He put the child into bed wrapped as she was in the shawl, for the sheets would be cold. Then he was afraid that she might not be able to move her arms, so he loosened her. The black eyes opened, rested on him vacantly, sank shut again. He covered her up. The last little quiver from the sobbing shook her breathing. This was his room, the room he had had before he married. It was familiar. He remembered what it was to be a young man untouched. He remained suspended. The child slept, pushing her small fists from the shawl. He could tell the woman her child was asleep, but he must go to the other landing. He started. There was the sound of the owls, the moaning of the woman. What an uncanny sound. It was not human, at least to a man. He went down to her room. Entering softly, she was lying still, with eyes shut, pale, tired. His heart leapt, fearing she was dead. Yet he knew perfectly well she was not. He saw the way her hair went loose over her temples. Her mouth was shut with suffering in a sort of grin. She was beautiful to him, but it was not human. He had a dread of her as she lay there. What had she to do with him? She was other than himself. Something made him go and touch her fingers that were still grasped on the sheet. Her brown-gray eyes opened and looked at him. She did not know him as himself, but she knew him as the man. She looked at him as a woman in childbirth looks at the man who begot the child in her, an impersonal look in the extreme hour, female to male. Her eyes closed again. A great, scalding peace went over him, burning his heart and his entrails, passing off into the infinite. When her pains began afresh, tearing her, he turned aside and could not look, but his heart in torture was at peace. His bowels were glad. He went downstairs and to the door outside, lifted his face to the rain, and felt the darkness striking unseen and steadily upon him. The swift, unseen threshing of the night upon him silenced him, and he was overcome. He turned away indoors humbly. There was the infinite world, eternal, unchanging, as well as the world of life. 3. Childhood of Anna Lenski. Tom Brangwen never loved his own son as he loved his stepchild Anna. When they told him it was a boy, he had a thrill of pleasure. He liked the confirmation of fatherhood. It gave him satisfaction to know he had a son, but he felt not very much outgoing to the baby itself. He was its father, that was enough. He was glad that his wife was mother of his child. She was serene, a little bit shadowy, as if she were transplanted. In the birth of the child, she seemed to lose connection with her former self. She became now really English, really Mrs. Brangwen. Her vitality, however, seemed lowered. She was still, to Brangwen, immeasurably beautiful. She was still passionate, with a flame of being, but the flame was not robust and present. Her eyes shone, her face glowed for him, but like some flower opened in the shade that could not bear the full light. She loved the baby, but even this, with a sort of dimness, a faint absence about her, a shadowiness even in her mother love. When Brangwen saw her nursing his child, happy, absorbed in it, a pain went over him like a thin flame. For he perceived how he must subdue himself in his approach to her. And he wanted again the robust, moral exchange of love and passion such as he had had at first with her, at one time and another, when they were matched at their highest intensity. This was the one experience for him now, and he wanted it always, with remorseless craving. She came to him again, with the same lifting of her mouth as had driven him almost mad with trammeled passion at first. She came to him again, and, his heart delirious in delight and readiness, he took her, and it was almost as before. Perhaps it was quite as before. At any rate, it made him know perfection. It established in him a constant, eternal knowledge. But it died down before he wanted it to die down. She was finished, she could take no more. And he was not exhausted, he wanted to go on. But it could not be. So he had to begin the bitter lesson, to abate himself, to take less than he wanted. For she was woman to him. All other women were her shadows. For she had satisfied him, and he wanted it to go on. And it could not. However, he raged, and, filled with suppression that became hot and bitter, hated her in his soul that she did not want him. However, he had mad outbursts, and drank and made ugly scenes. Still he knew he was only kicking against the pricks. It was not. He had to learn that she would not want him enough, as much as he demanded that she should want him. It was that she could not. She could only want him in her own way and to her own measure. And she had spent much life before he found her as she was, the woman who could take him and give him fulfillment. She had taken him and given him fulfillment. She still could do so, in her own times and ways. But he must control himself, measure himself to her. He wanted to give her all his love, all his passion, all his essential energy. But it could not be. He must find other things than her, other centers of living. She sat close and impregnable with the child, and he was jealous of the child. But he loved her, and time came to give some sort of course to his troublesome current of life, so that it did not foam and flood and make misery. He formed another center of love in her child, Anna. Gradually, a part of his stream of life was diverted to the child, relieving the main flood to his wife. Also, he sought the company of men. He drank heavily now and again. The child ceased to have so much anxiety for her mother after the baby came. Seeing the mother with the baby boy, delighted and serene and secure, Anna was at first puzzled. Then gradually she became indignant, and at last her little life settled on its own swivel. She was no more strained and distorted to support her mother. She became more childish, not so abnormal, not charged with cares she could not understand. The charge of the mother, the satisfying of the mother, had devolved elsewhere than on her. Gradually the child was freed. She became an independent, forgetful little soul, loving from her own center. Of her own choice, she then loved Brangwen most, or most obviously. For these two made a little life together. They had a joint activity. It amused him, at evening, to teach her to count, or to say her letters. He remembered for her all the little nursery rhymes and childish songs that lay forgotten at the bottom of his brain. At first she thought them rubbish, but he laughed and she laughed. They became to her a huge joke. Old King Cole, she thought, was Brangwen. Mother Hubbard was Tilly. Her mother was the old woman who lived in a shoe. It was a frantic delight to the child, this nonsense, after her years with her mother, after the poignant folktales she had had from her mother, which always troubled and mystified her soul. She shared a sort of recklessness with her father, a complete, chosen carelessness that had the laugh of ridicule in it. He loved to make her voice go high and shouting and defiant with laughter. The baby was dark-skinned and dark-haired, like the mother, and had hazel eyes. Brangwen called him the blackbird. "Hello," Brangwen would cry, starting as he heard the wail of the child announcing it wanted to be taken out of the cradle. "There's the blackbird tuning up." The blackbird singing. Anna would shout with delight. The blackbird singing. When the pie was opened, Brangwen shouted in his bawling bass voice. Going over to the cradle, the bird began to sing. "Wasn't it a dainty dish to set before a king?" cried Anna, her eyes flashing with joy as she uttered the cryptic words, looking at Brangwen for confirmation. He sat down with the baby, saying loudly, "Sing up, my lad, sing up." And the baby cried loudly, and Anna shouted lustily, dancing in wild bliss. "Sing a song of sixpence pocketful of posies, Aska, Aska." Then she stopped suddenly in silence and looked at Brangwen again, her eyes flashing as she shouted loudly and delightedly, "I've got it wrong! I've got it wrong!" "Oh, my sirs," said Tilly, entering. "What a racket!" Brangwen hushed the child, and Anna flipped and danced on. She loved her wild bursts of rowdiness with her father. Tilly hated it. Mrs. Brangwen did not mind. Anna did not care much for other children. She domineered them. She treated them as if they were extremely young and incapable. To her, they were little people. They were not her equals. So she was mostly alone, flying round the farm, entertaining the farm hands and Tilly and the servant girl, whirring on and never ceasing. She loved driving with Brangwen in the trap. Then, sitting high up and bowling along, her passion for eminence and dominance was satisfied. She was like a little savage in her arrogance. She thought her father important. She was installed beside him on high. And they spanked along beside the high, flourishing hedge tops, surveying the activity of the countryside. When people shouted a greeting to him from the road below, and Brangwen shouted jovially back, her little voice was soon heard shrilling along with his, followed by her chuckling laugh, when she looked up at her father with bright eyes, and they laughed at each other. And soon it was the custom for the passer-by to sing out, "How art her, Tom?" "Well, my lady," or else, "Mornin', Tom, mornin', my lass," or else, "You're off together then?" or else, "You're lookin' rarely, you two." Anna would respond with her father, "How are you, John?" "Good mornin', William." "I makin' for Derby," shrilling as loudly as she could. Though often in response to "You're off out a bit then," she would reply, "Yes, we are," to the great joy of all. She did not like the people who saluted him and did not salute her. She went into the public house with him, if he had to call, and often sat beside him in the bar parlor as he drank his beer or brandy. The landladies paid court to her in the obsequious way landladies have. "Well, little lady, and what's your name?" "Anna Brangwen," came the immediate, haughty answer. "Indeed it is. And do you like driving in a trap with your father?" "Yes," said Anna, shy, but bored by these inanities. She had a touch-me-not way of blighting the inane inquiries of grown-up people. "My word, she's a false little thing," the landlady would say to Brangwen. "Aye," he answered, not encouraging comments on the child. Then there followed the present of a biscuit or of cake, which Anna accepted as her dues. "What does she say, that I'm a false little thing?" the small girl asked afterwards. "She means you're a sharpshins." Anna hesitated. She did not understand. Then she laughed at some absurdity she found. Soon he took her every week to market with him. "I can come, can I?" she asked every Saturday or Thursday morning, when he made himself look fine in his dress of a gentleman farmer. And his face clouded at having to refuse her. So at last, he overcame his own shyness and tucked her beside him. They drove into Nottingham and put up at the Black Swan. So far all right. Then he wanted to leave her at the inn. But he saw her face and knew it was impossible. So he mustered his courage and set off with her, holding her hand, to the cattle market. She stared in bewilderment, flitting silent at his side. But in the cattle market she shrank from the press of men, all in heavy, filthy boots and leathern leggins. And the road underfoot was all nasty with cow muck. And it frightened her to see the cattle in the square pens, so many horns and so little enclosure, and such a madness of men, and a yelling of drovers. Also, she felt her father was embarrassed by her, and ill at ease. He brought her a cake at the refreshment booth, and set her on a seat. A man hailed him. "Good morning, Tom. That thine, then?" And the bearded farmer jerked his head at Anna. "Aye," said Brangwen, deprecating. "I did not know that one that old." "No, it's my missus's." "Oh, that's it." And the man looked at Anna as if she were some odd little cattle. She glowered with black eyes. Brangwen left her there, in charge of the barman, whilst he went to see about the selling of some young stirks. Farmers, butchers, drovers, dirty, uncouth men from whom she shrank instinctively stared down at her as she sat on her seat, then went to get their drink, talking in unabated tones. All was big and violent about her. "Whose child might that be?" they asked of the barman. "It belongs to Tom Brangwen." The child sat on in neglect, watching the door for her father. He never came. Many men came, but not he, and she sat like a shadow. She knew one did not cry in such a place. And every man looked at her inquisitively. She shut herself away from them. A deep, gathering coldness of isolation took hold on her. He was never coming back. She sat on, frozen, unmoving. When she had become blank and timeless, he came, and she slipped off her seat to him, like one come back from the dead. He had sold his beast as quickly as he could, but all the business was not finished. He took her again through the hurtling welter of the cattle market. Then at last they turned and went out through the gate. He was always hailing one man or another, always stopping to gossip about land and cattle and horses and other things she did not understand, standing in the filth and the smell, among the legs and great boots of men. And always she heard the questions. "What lass is that, then? I didn't know that one o' that age." "It belongs to my missus." Anna was very conscious of her derivation from her mother, in the end, and of her alienation. But at last they were away, and Brangwen went with her into a little dark, ancient eating house in the Bridlesmith Gate. They had cow's tail soup and meat and cabbage and potatoes. Other men, other people, came into the dark, vaulted place to eat. Anna was wide-eyed and silent with wonder. Then they went into the big market, into the corn exchange, then to shops. He bought her a little book off a stall. He loved buying things, odd things that he thought would be useful. Then they went to the Black Swan, and she drank milk and he brandy, and they harnessed the horse and drove off, up the Derby Road. She was tired out with wonder and marveling. But the next day, when she thought of it, she skipped, flipping her leg in the odd dance she did, and talked the whole time of what had happened to her. of what she had seen. It lasted her all the week, and the next Saturday she was eager to go again. She became a familiar figure in the cattle market, sitting waiting in the little booth. But she liked best to go to Derby. There her father had more friends, and she liked the familiarity of the smaller town, the nearness of the river, the strangeness that did not frighten her. It was so much smaller. She liked the covered-in market and the old women. She liked the George Inn, where her father put up. The landlord was Brangwen's old friend, and Anna was made much of. She sat many a day in the cozy parlor talking to Mr. Wigginton, a fat man with red hair, the landlord. And when the farmers all gathered at 12 o'clock for dinner, she was a little heroine. At first, she would only glower or hiss at these strange men with their uncouth accent. But they were good-humored. She was a little oddity, with her fierce, fair hair like spun glass sticking out in a flamy halo round the apple-blossom face and the black eyes, and the men liked an oddity. She kindled their attention. She was very angry because Marriott, a gentleman farmer from Ambergate, called her the little polecat. "Why, you're a polecat," he said to her. "I'm not," she flashed. "You are. That's just how a polecat goes." She thought about it. "Well, you're," she began. "I'm what?" She looked him up and down. "You're a bow-leg man," which he was. There was a roar of laughter. They loved her that she was indomitable. "Ah," said Marriott, "only a polecat says that." "Well, I am a polecat," she flamed. There was another roar of laughter from the men. They loved to tease her. "Well, me little maid," Braithwaite would say to her, "and how's to lamb's wool?" He gave a tug at a glistening, pale piece of her hair. "It's not lamb's wool," said Anna, indignantly putting back her offended lock. "Why, what's it then?" "It's hair." "Hair? Wherever done they rear that sort?" "Wherever done they?" she asked, in dialect, her curiosity overcoming her. Instead of answering, he shouted with joy. It was the triumph to make her speak dialect. She had one enemy, the man they called Nut-Nat, or Nat-Nat, a cretin with inturned feet who came flap-lapping along, shoulder jerking up at every step. This poor creature sold nuts in the public houses where he was known. He had no roof to his mouth, and the men used to mock his speech. The first time he came into the George when Anna was there, she asked after he had gone, her eyes very round. "Why does he do that when he walks?" "I canna help isself, ducky, it's to make go teach fellow." She thought about it. Then she laughed nervously. And then she bethought herself, her cheeks flushed, and she cried. "He's a horrid man." "Nay, he's non-horrid. He canna help it if he were struck that road." But when poor Nat came wambling in again, she slid away, and she would not eat his nuts if the men bought them for her. And when the farmers gambled at dominoes for them, she was angry. "They are dirty man's nuts," she cried. So a revulsion started against Nat, who had not long after to go to the workhouse. There grew in Brangwen's heart now a secret desire to make her a lady. His brother Alfred, in Nottingham, had caused a great scandal by becoming the lover of an educated woman, a lady, widow of a doctor. Very often, Alfred Brangwen went down as a friend to her cottage, which was in Derbyshire, leaving his wife and family for a day or two, then returning to them. And no one dared gainsay him, for he was a strong-willed, direct man, and he said he was a friend of this widow. One day Brangwen met his brother on the station. "Where are you going to then?" asked the younger brother. "I'm going down to Wirksworth." "You've got friends down there, I'm told." "Yes." "I still have to be looking in when I'm down that road." "You please yourself." Tom Brangwen was so curious about the woman that the next time he was in Wirksworth, he asked for her house. He found a beautiful cottage on the steep side of a hill, looking clean over the town, that lay in the bottom of the basin, and away at the old quarries on the opposite side of the space. Mrs. Forbes was in the garden. She was a tall woman with white hair. It was autumn. She wore a wide-brimmed hat. Brangwen blushed to the roots of his hair and did not know what to say. "I thought I might look in," he said, "knowing you were friends of my brother's. I had to come to Wirksworth." She saw at once that he was a Brangwen.
"Will you come in?" she said.
"My father is lying down." She took him into a drawing room full of books with a piano and a violin stand. And they talked, she simply and easily. She was full of dignity. The room was of a kind Brangwen had never known. The atmosphere seemed open and spacious, like a mountaintop to him. "Does my brother like reading?" he asked. "Some things. He has been reading Herbert Spencer, and we read Browning sometimes." Brangwen was full of admiration, deep, thrilling, almost reverential admiration. He looked at her with lit-up eyes when she said, "We read." At last he burst out, looking round the room. "I didn't know our Alfred was this way inclined. He is quite an unusual man." He looked at her in amazement. She evidently had a new idea of his brother. She evidently appreciated him. He looked again at the woman. She was about 40, straight, rather hard, a curious, separate creature. Himself, he was not in love with her. There was something chilling about her. But he was filled with boundless admiration. At tea time, he was introduced to her father, an invalid who had to be helped about, but who was ruddy and well-favored, with snowy hair and watery blue eyes, and a courtly, naive manner that again was new and strange to Brangwen, so suave, so merry, so innocent. His brother was this woman's lover. It was too amazing. Brangwen went home despising himself for his own poor way of life. He was a clodhopper and a bore, dull, stuck in the mud. More than ever he wanted to clamber out to this visionary, polite world. He was well off. He was as well off as Alfred, who could not have above 600 a year, all told. He himself made about 400 and could make more. His investments got better every day. Why did he not do something? His wife was a lady also. But when he got to the marsh, he realized how fixed everything was, how the other form of life was beyond him, and he regretted for the first time that he had succeeded to the farm. He felt a prisoner, sitting safe and easy and unadventurous. He might, with risk, have done more with himself. He could neither read Browning nor Herbert Spencer, nor have access to such a room as Mrs. Forbes's. All that form of life was outside him. But then he said he did not want it. The excitement of the visit began to pass off. The next day he was himself, and if he thought of the other woman, there was something about her and her place that he did not like, something cold, something alien, as if she were not a woman but an inhuman being who used up human life for cold, unliving purposes. The evening came on. He played with Anna, and then sat alone with his own wife. She was sewing. He sat very still, smoking, perturbed. He was aware of his wife's quiet figure, and quiet dark had bent over her needle. It was too quiet for him. It was too peaceful. He wanted to smash the walls down and let the night in so that his wife should not be so secure and quiet, sitting there. He wished the air were not so close and narrow. His wife was obliterated from him. She was in her own world, quiet, secure, unnoticed, unnoticing. He was shut down by her. He rose to go out. He could not sit still any longer. He must get out of this oppressive, shut-down woman haunt. His wife lifted her head and looked at him. "Are you going out?" she asked. He looked down and met her eyes. They were darker than darkness and gave deeper space. He felt himself retreating before her, defensive, whilst her eyes followed and tracked him on. "I was just going up to Kossethe," he said. She remained watching him. "Why do you go?" she said. His heart beat fast, and he sat down slowly. "No reason particular," he said, beginning to fill his pipe again mechanically. "Why do you go away so often?" she said. "But you don't want me," he replied. She was silent for a while. "You do not want to be with me any more," she said. It startled him. How did she know this truth? He thought it was his secret. He said. "You want to find something else," she said. He did not answer. Did he? He asked himself. "You should not want so much attention," she said. "You are not a baby." "I'm not grumbling," he said, yet he knew he was. "You think you have not enough," she said. "How enough?" "You think you have not enough in me. But how do you know me? What do you do to make me love you?" He was flabbergasted. "I never said I hadn't enough in you," he replied. "I didn't know you wanted making to love me. What do you want?" You don't make it good between us anymore. You're not interested. You do not make me want you. And you don't make me want you, do you now? There was a silence. They were such strangers. Would you like to have another woman? She asked. His eyes grew round. He did not know where he was. How could she, his own wife, say such a thing? But she sat there, small and foreign and separate. It dawned upon him she did not consider herself his wife, except in so far as they agreed. She did not feel she had married him. At any rate, she was willing to allow he might want another woman. A gap, a space opened before him. No, he said slowly. What other woman should I want? Like your brother, she said. He was silent for some time, ashamed also. What of her? He said. I didn't like the woman. Yes, you liked her, she answered persistently. He stared in wonder at his own wife as she told him his own heart so callously. And he was indignant. What right had she to sit there telling him these things? She was his wife. What right had she to speak to him like this, as if she were a stranger? I didn't, he said. I want no woman. Yes, you would like to be like Alfred. His silence was one of angry frustration. He was astonished. He had told her of his visit to Wirksworth, but briefly, without interest, he thought. As she sat with her strange dark face turned towards him, her eyes watched him, inscrutable, casting him up. He began to oppose her. She was again the active unknown facing him. Must he admit her? He resisted involuntarily. Why should you want to find a woman who is more to you than me? She said. The turbulence raged in his breast. I don't, he said. Why do you? She repeated. Why do you want to deny me? Suddenly, in a flash, he saw she might be lonely, isolated, unsure. She had seemed to him the utterly certain, satisfied, absolute, excluding him. Could she need anything? Why aren't you satisfied with me? I'm not satisfied with you. Paul used to come to me and take me like a man does. You only leave me alone or take me like your cattle, quickly, to forget me again so that you can forget me again. What am I to remember about you? Said Brangwen. I want you to know there is somebody there besides yourself. Well, don't I know it? You come to me as if it was for nothing, as if I was nothing there. When Paul came to me, I was something to him. A woman, I was. To you I am nothing. It is like cattle or nothing. You make me feel as if I was nothing, he said. They were silent. She sat watching him. He could not move. His soul was seething and chaotic. She turned to her sewing again, but the sight of her bent before him held him and would not let him be. She was a strange, hostile, dominant thing, yet not quite hostile. As he sat, he felt his limbs were strong and hard. He sat in strength. She was silent for a long time, stitching. He was aware, poignantly, of the round shape of her head, very intimate, compelling. She lifted her head and sighed. The blood burned in him. Her voice ran to him like fire. Come here, she said, unsure. For some moments he did not move. Then he rose slowly and went across the hearth. It required an almost deathly effort of volition, or of acquiescence. He stood before her and looked down at her. Her face was shining again. Her eyes were shining again like terrible laughter. It was to him terrible how she could be transfigured. He could not look at her. It burnt his heart. My love, she said. And she put her arms round him as he stood before her round his thighs, pressing him against her breast. And her hands on him seemed to reveal to him the mold of his own nakedness. He was passionately lovely to himself. He could not bear to look at her. My dear, she said. He knew she spoke a foreign language. The fear was like bliss in his heart. He looked down. Her face was shining. Her eyes were full of light. She was awful. He suffered from the compulsion to her. She was the awful unknown. He bent down to her, suffering, unable to let go, unable to let himself go, yet drawn, driven. She was now the transfigured. She was wonderful, beyond him. He wanted to go, but he could not as yet kiss her. He was himself apart. Easiest he could kiss her feet, but he was too ashamed for the actual deed, which were like an affront. She waited for him to meet her, not to bow before her and serve her. She wanted his active participation, not his submission. She put her fingers on him, and it was torture to him that he must give himself to her actively, participate in her, that he must meet and embrace and know her, who was other than himself. There was that in him which shrank from yielding to her, resisted the relaxing towards her, opposed the mingling with her, even while he most desired it. He was afraid. He wanted to save himself. There were a few moments of stillness. Then gradually, the tension, the withholding relaxed in him, and he began to flow towards her. She was beyond him, the unattainable. But he let go his hold on himself. He relinquished himself and knew the subterranean force of his desire to come to her, to be with her, to mingle with her, losing himself to find her, to find himself in her. He began to approach her, to draw near. His blood beat up in waves of desire. He wanted to come to her, to meet her. She was there if he could reach her. The reality of her, who was just beyond him, absorbed him. Blind and destroyed, he pressed forward, nearer, nearer, to receive the consummation of himself. He received within the darkness which should swallow him and yield him up to himself. If he could come really within the blazing kernel of darkness, if really he could be destroyed, burnt away till he lit with her in one consummation, that were supreme, supreme. Their coming together now, after 2 years of married life, was much more wonderful to them than it had been before. It was the entry into another circle of existence. It was the baptism to another life. It was the complete confirmation. Their feet trod strange ground of knowledge. Their footsteps were lit up with discovery. Wherever they walked, it was well. The world re-echoed round them in discovery. They went gladly and forgetful. Everything was lost, and everything was found. The new world was discovered. It remained only to be explored. They had passed through the doorway into the further space, where movement was so big that it contained bonds and constraints and labors, and still was complete liberty. She was the doorway to him, he to her. At last they had thrown open the doors, each to the other, and had stood in the doorways facing each other, whilst the light flooded out from behind onto each of their faces. It was the transfiguration, glorification, the admission. And always the light of the transfiguration burned on in their hearts. He went his way, as before. She went her way. To the rest of the world there seemed no change. But to the two of them, there was the perpetual wonder of the transfiguration. He did not know her any better, any more precisely, now that he knew her altogether. Poland, her husband, the war, he understood no more of this in her. He did not understand her foreign nature, half German, half Polish, nor her foreign speech. But he knew her meaning, without understanding. What she said, what she spoke, this was a blind gesture on her part. In herself she walked strong and clear. He knew her, he saluted her, was with her. What was memory after all, but the recording of a number of possibilities which had never been fulfilled? What was Paul Lenski to her, but an unfulfilled possibility to which he, Brangwen, was the reality and the fulfillment? What did it matter that Anna Lenski was born of Lydia and Paul? God was her father and her mother. He had passed through the married pair without fully making himself known to them. Now he was declared to Brangwen and to Lydia Brangwen as they stood together. When at last they had joined hands, the house was finished, and the Lord took up his abode. And they were glad. The days went on as before. Brangwen went out to his work. His wife nursed her child and attended in some measure to the farm. They did not think of each other. Why should they? Only when she touched him, he knew her instantly, that she was with him, near him, that she was the gateway and the way out, that she was beyond, and that he was traveling in her through the beyond. Whither? What does it matter? He responded always. When she called, he answered. When he asked, her response came at once, or at length. Anna's soul was put at peace between them. She looked from one to the other, and she saw them established to her safety, and she was free. She played between the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud in confidence, having the assurance on her right hand and the assurance on her left. She was no longer called upon to uphold with her childish might the broken end of the arch. Her father and her mother now met to the span of the heavens, and she The child was free to play in the space beneath, between. 4. Girlhood of Anna Brangwen. When Anna was 9 years old, Brangwen sent her to the dame's school in Kossuth. There she went, flipping and dancing in her inconsequential fashion, doing very much as she liked, disconcerting old Miss Coates by her indifference to respectability and by her lack of reverence. Anna only laughed at Miss Coates, liked her, and patronized her in superb, childish fashion. The girl was at once shy and wild. She had a curious contempt for ordinary people, a benevolent superiority. She was very shy and tortured with misery when people did not like her. On the other hand, she cared very little for anybody save her mother, whom she still rather resentfully worshipped, and her father, whom she loved and patronized, but upon whom she depended. These two, her mother and father, held her still in fee. But she was free of other people, towards whom, on the whole, she took the benevolent attitude. She deeply hated ugliness or intrusion or arrogance, however. As a child, she was as proud and shadowy as a tiger, and as aloof. She could confer favors, but, save from her mother and father, she could receive none. She hated people who came too near to her. Like a wild thing, she wanted her distance. She mistrusted intimacy. In Kossuth and Ilkeston, she was always an alien. She had plenty of acquaintances, but no friends. Very few people whom she met were significant to her. They seemed part of a herd, undistinguished. She did not take people very seriously. She had 2 brothers, Tom, dark-haired, small, volatile, whom she was intimately related to but whom she never mingled with, and Fred, fair and responsive, whom she adored but did not consider as a real, separate thing. She was too much the center of her own universe, too little aware of anything outside. The first person she met, who affected her as a real, living person, whom she regarded as having definite existence, was Baron Skrebensky, her mother's friend. He also was a Polish exile who had taken orders and had received from Mr. Gladstone a small country living in Yorkshire. When Anna was about 10 years old, she went with her mother to spend a few days with the Baron Skrebensky. He was very unhappy in his red brick vicarage. He was vicar of a country church, a living worth a little over £200 a year, but he had a large parish containing several collieries, with a new, raw, heathen population. He went to the north of England expecting homage from the common people, for he was an aristocrat. He was roughly, even cruelly received, but he never understood it. He remained a fiery aristocrat, only he had to learn to avoid his parishioners. Anna was very much impressed by him. He was a smallish man with a rugged, rather crumpled face and blue eyes set very deep and glowing. His wife was a tall, thin woman of noble Polish family, mad with pride. He still spoke broken English, for he had kept very close to his wife, both of them forlorn in this strange, inhospitable country, and they always spoke in Polish together. He was disappointed with Mrs. Brangwen's soft, natural English, very disappointed that her child spoke no Polish. Anna loved to watch him. She liked the big, new, rambling vicarage, desolate and stark on its hill. It was so exposed, so bleak and bold after the marsh. The Baron talked endlessly in Polish to Mrs. Brangwen. He made furious gestures with his hands. His blue eyes were full of fire. And to Anna, there was a significance about his sharp, flinging movements. Something in her responded to his extravagance and his exuberant manner. She thought him a very wonderful person. She was shy of him. She liked him to talk to her. She felt a sense of freedom near him. She never could tell how she knew it, but she did know that he was a Knight of Malta. She could never remember whether she had seen his star or cross of his order or not, but it flashed in her mind, like a symbol. He at any rate represented to the child the real world, where kings and lords and princes moved and fulfilled their shining lives, whilst queens and ladies and princesses upheld the noble order. She had recognized the Baron Skrebensky as a real person. He had had some regard for her. But when she did not see him anymore, he faded and became a memory. But as a memory, he was always alive to her. Anna became a tall, awkward girl. Her eyes were still very dark and quick, but they had grown careless, They had lost their watchful, hostile look. Her fierce, spun hair turned brown. It grew heavier and was tied back. She was sent to a young ladies' school in Nottingham. And at this period, she was absorbed in becoming a young lady. She was intelligent enough, but not interested in learning. At first, she thought all the girls at school very ladylike and wonderful, and she wanted to be like them. She came to a speedy disillusion. They galled and maddened her. They were petty and mean. After the loose, generous atmosphere of her home, where little things did not count, she was always uneasy in the world that would snap and bite at every trifle. A quick change came over her. She mistrusted herself. She mistrusted the outer world. She did not want to go on. She did not want to go out into it. She wanted to go no further. "What do I care about that lot of girls?" she would say to her father, contemptuously. "They are nobody." The trouble was that the girls would not accept Anna at her measure. They would have her according to themselves, or not at all. So she was confused, seduced. She became as they were for a time, and then, in revulsion, she hated them furiously. "Why don't you ask some of your girls here?" her father would say. "They're not coming here," she cried. "And why not?" "They're bagatelle," she said, using one of her mother's rare phrases. "Bagatelles or billiards, it makes no matter. They're nice young lasses enough." But Anna was not to be won over. She had a curious shrinking from commonplace people, and particularly from the young lady of her day. She would not go into company because of the ill-at-ease feeling other people brought upon her. And she never could decide whether it were her fault or theirs. She half respected these other people, and continuous disillusion maddened her. She wanted to respect them. Still, she thought the people she did not know were wonderful. Those she knew seemed always to be limiting her, tying her up in little falsities that irritated her beyond bearing. She would rather stay at home and avoid the rest of the world, leaving it illusory. For at the Marsh life had indeed a certain freedom and largeness. There was no fret about money, no mean little precedents, nor care for what other people thought, because neither Mrs. Brangwen nor Brangwen could be sensible of any judgment passed on them from outside. Their lives were too separate. So Anna was only easy at home, where the common sense and the supreme relation between her parents produced a freer standard of being than she could find outside. Where, outside the Marsh, could she find the tolerant dignity she had been brought up in? Her parents stood undiminished and unaware of criticism. The people she met outside seemed to begrudge her her very existence. They seemed to want to belittle her also. She was exceedingly reluctant to go amongst them. She depended upon her mother and her father, and yet she wanted to go out. At school, or in the world, she was usually at fault. She felt usually that she ought to be slinking in disgrace. She never felt quite sure in herself whether she were wrong or whether the others were wrong. She had not done her lessons. Well, she did not see any reason why she should do her lessons if she did not want to. Was there some occult reason why she should? Were these people, schoolmistresses, representatives of some mystic right, some higher good? They seemed to think so themselves. But she could not for her life see why a woman should bully and insult her because she did not know 30 lines of As You Like It. After all, what did it matter if she knew them or not? Nothing could persuade her that it was of the slightest importance, because she despised inwardly the coarsely working nature of the mistress. Therefore, she was always at outs with authority. From constant telling, she came almost to believe in her own badness, her own intrinsic inferiority. She felt that she ought always to be in a state of slinking disgrace if she fulfilled what was expected of her. But she rebelled. She never really believed in her own badness. At the bottom of her heart, she despised the other people who carped and were loud over trifles. She despised them and wanted revenge on them. She hated them whilst they had power over her. Still, she kept an ideal, a free, proud lady absolved from the petty ties, existing beyond petty considerations. She would see such ladies in pictures. Alexandra, Princess of Wales, was one of her models. This lady was proud and royal, and stepped indifferently over all small, mean desires. So thought Anna in her heart. And the girl did up her hair high under a little slanting hat. Her skirts were fashionably bunched up. She wore an elegant, skin-fitting coat. Her father was delighted. Anna was very proud in her bearing, too naturally indifferent to smaller bonds to satisfy Ilkeston, which would have liked to put her down. But Brangwen was having no such thing. If she chose to be royal, royal she should be. He stood like a rock between her and the world. After the fashion of his family, he grew stout and handsome. His blue eyes were full of light, twinkling and sensitive. His manner was deliberate, but hearty, warm. His capacity for living his own life without attention from his neighbors made them respect him. They would run to do anything for him. He did not consider them, but was open-handed towards them, so they made profit of their willingness. He liked people so long as they remained in the background. Mrs. Brangwen went on in her own way, following her own devices. She had her husband, her 2 sons, and Anna. These staked out and marked her horizon. The other people were outsiders. Inside her own world, her life passed along like a dream for her. It lapsed, and she lived within its lapse, active and always pleased, intent. She scarcely noticed the outer things at all. What was outside, non-existent. She did not mind if the boys fought, so long as it was out of her presence. But if they fought when she was by, she was angry, and they were afraid of her. She did not care if they broke a window of a railway carriage or sold their watches to have a revel at the Goose Fair. Brangwen was perhaps angry over these things. To the mother, they were insignificant. It was odd little things that offended her. She was furious if the boys hung around the slaughterhouse. She was displeased when the school reports were bad. It did not matter how many sins her boys were accused of, so long as they were not stupid or inferior. If they seemed to brook insult, she hated them, and it was only a certain gaucherie, a gawkiness on Anna's part that irritated her against the girl. Certain forms of clumsiness, grossness, made the mother's eyes glow with curious rage. Otherwise, she was pleased, indifferent.
Pursuing her splendid lady ideal, Anna became a lofty demoiselle of 16, plagued by family shortcomings. She was very sensitive to her father. She knew if he had been drinking, were he ever so little affected, and she could not bear it. He flushed when he drank, the veins stood out on his temples, there was a twinkling, cavalier boisterousness in his eye, his manner was jovially overbearing and mocking. And it angered her. When she heard his loud, roaring, boisterous mockery, an anger of resentment filled her. She was quick to forestall him, the moment he came in.
"You look a sight, you do, red in the face," she cried. "I might look worse if I was green," he answered, boozing in Ilkeston. "And what's wrong, why, Ailson?" She flounced away. He watched her with amused, twinkling eyes, yet in spite of himself said that she flouted him. They were a curious family, a law to themselves, separate from the world, isolated, a small republic set in invisible bounds. The mother was quite indifferent to Ilkeston and Kossuth, to any claims made on her from outside. She was very shy of any outsider, exceedingly courteous, winning even. But the moment the visitor had gone, she laughed and dismissed him. He did not exist. It had been all a game to her. She was still a foreigner, unsure of her ground. But alone with her own children and husband at the marsh, she was mistress of a little native land that lacked nothing. She had some belief somewhere, never defined. She had been brought up a Roman Catholic. She had gone to the Church of England for protection. The outward form was a matter of indifference to her. Yet she had some fundamental religion. It was as if she worshipped God as a mystery, never seeking in the least to define what he was. And inside her, the subtle sense of the great absolute wherein she had her being was very strong. The English dogma never reached her. The language was too foreign. Through it all she felt the great separator who held life in his hands, gleaming, imminent, terrible, the great mystery, immediate beyond all telling. She shone and gleamed to the mystery, whom she knew through all her senses. She glanced with strange, mystic superstitions that never found expression in the English language. never mounted to thought in English. But so she lived, within a potent, sensuous belief that included her family and contained her destiny. To this she had reduced her husband. He existed with her entirely indifferent to the general values of the world. Her very ways, the very mark of her eyebrows were symbols and indication to him. There, on the farm with her, he lived through a mystery of life and death and creation, strange, profound ecstasies and incommunicable satisfactions, of which the rest of the world knew nothing, which made the pair of them apart and respected in the English village, for they were also well-to-do. But Anna was only half safe within her mother's unthinking knowledge. She had a mother-of-pearl rosary that had been her own father's. What it meant to her she could never say. But the string of moonlight and silver, when she had it between her fingers, filled her with strange passion. She learned at school a little Latin, she learned an Ave Maria and a Pater Noster, she learned how to say her rosary. But that was no good. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tuae Jesus. Ave Maria, Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. It was not right somehow. What these words meant when translated was not the same as the pale rosary meant. There was a discrepancy, a falsehood. It irritated her to say, Dominus tecum, or benedicta tu in mulieribus. She loved the mystic words, Ave Maria, Sancta Maria. She was moved by benedictus fructus ventris tuae Jesus, and by nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. But none of it was quite real. It was not satisfactory somehow. She avoided her rosary, because, moving her with curious passion as it did, it meant only these not very significant things. She put it away. It was her instinct to put all these things away. It was her instinct to avoid thinking, to avoid it, to save herself. She was 17, touchy, full of spirits, and very moody, quick to flush and always uneasy, uncertain. For some reason or other, she turned more to her father. She felt almost flashes of hatred for her mother. Her mother's dark muzzle and curiously insidious ways, her mother's utter surety and confidence, her strange satisfaction, even triumph, her mother's way of laughing at things and her mother's silent overriding of vexatious propositions. Most of all, her mother's triumphant power maddened the girl. She became sudden and incalculable. Often she stood at the window, looking out, as if she wanted to go. Sometimes she mixed with people, but always she came home in anger, as if she were diminished, belittled, almost degraded. There was over the house a kind of dark silence and intensity in which passion worked its inevitable conclusions. There was in the house a sort of richness, a deep, inarticulate interchange which made other places seem thin and unsatisfying. Brangwen could sit silent, smoking in his chair. The mother could move about in her quiet, insidious way, and the sense of the two presences was powerful, sustaining. The whole intercourse was wordless, intense and close. But Anna was uneasy. She wanted to get away. Yet wherever she went, there came upon her that feeling of thinness, as if she were made smaller, belittled. She hastened home. There she raged and interrupted the strong, settled interchange. Sometimes her mother turned on her with a fierce, destructive anger, in which was no pity or consideration. And Anna shrank, afraid. She went to her father. He would still listen to the spoken word, which fell sterile on the unheeding mother. Sometimes Anna talked to her father. She tried to discuss people, she wanted to know what was meant. But her father became uneasy. He did not want to have things dragged into consciousness. Only out of consideration for her, he listened. And there was a kind of bristling rouseness in the room. The cat got up and, stretching itself, went uneasily to the door. Mrs. Brangwen was silent. She seemed ominous. Anna could not go on with her fault-finding, her criticism, her expression of dissatisfactions. She felt even her father against her. He had a strong, dark bond with her mother, a potent intimacy that existed inarticulate and wild, following its own course, and savage if interrupted, uncovered. Nevertheless, Brangwen was uneasy about the girl. The whole house continued to be disturbed. She had a pathetic, baffled appeal. She was hostile to her parents, even whilst she lived entirely with them, within their spell. Many ways she tried of escape. She became an assiduous churchgoer, but the language meant nothing to her. It seemed false. She hated to hear things expressed, put into words. Whilst the religious feelings were inside her, they were passionately moving. In the mouth of the clergyman, they were false, indecent. She tried to read, but again the tedium and the sense of the falsity of the spoken word put her off. She went to stay with girlfriends. At first she thought it splendid, but then the inner boredom came on. It seemed to her all nothingness, and she felt always belittled, as if never could she stretch her length and stride her stride. Her mind reverted often to the torture cell of a certain bishop of France, in which the victim could neither stand nor lie stretched out. Never. Not that she thought of herself in any connection with this, but often there came into her mind the wonder how the cell was built, and she could feel the horror of the crampedness as something very real. She was, however, only 18 when a letter came from Mrs. Alfred Brangwen in Nottingham, saying that her son William was coming to Ilkeston to take a place as junior draftsman, scarcely more than apprentice, in a lace factory. He was 20 years old, and would the Marsh Brangwens be friendly with him? Tom Brangwen at once wrote offering the young man a home at the Marsh. This was not accepted, but the Nottingham Brangwens expressed gratitude. There had never been much love lost between the Nottingham Brangwens and the Marsh. Indeed, Mrs. Alfred, having inherited £3,000 and having occasion to be dissatisfied with her husband, held aloof from all the Brangwens whatsoever. She affected, however, some esteem of Mrs. Tom, as she called the Polish woman, saying that at any rate she was a lady. Anna Brangwen was faintly excited at the news of her cousin Will's coming to Ilkeston. She knew plenty of young men, but they had never become real to her. She had seen in this young gallant a nose she liked, in that a pleasant mustache, in the other a nice way of wearing clothes, in one a ridiculous fringe of hair, in another a comical way of talking. They were objects of amusement and faint wonder to her, rather than real beings, the young men. The only man she knew was her father, and, as he was something large, looming, a kind of godhead, he embraced all manhood for her, and other men were just incidental. She remembered her cousin Will. He had town clothes and was thin, with a very curious head, black as jet, with hair like sleek, thin fur. It was a curious head. It reminded her she knew not of what. Of some animal, some mysterious animal that lived in the darkness under the leaves and never came out, but which lived vividly, swift and intense. She always thought of him with that black, keen, blind head, and she considered him odd. He appeared at the Marsh one Sunday morning, a rather long, thin youth with a bright face and a curious self-possession among his shyness, a native unawareness of what other people might be, since he was himself. When Anna came downstairs in her Sunday clothes, ready for church, he rose and greeted her conventionally, shaking hands. His manners were better than hers. She flushed. She noticed that he now had a thick fledge on his upper lip, a black, finely shapen line marking his wide mouth. It rather repelled her. It reminded her of the thin, fine fur of his hair. She was aware of something strange in him. His voice had rather high upper notes and very resonant middle notes. It was queer. She wondered why he did it, but he sat very naturally in the Marsh living room. He had some uncouthness, some natural self-possession of the Brangwens that made him at home there. Anna was rather troubled by the strangely intimate, affectionate way her father had towards this young man. He seemed gentle towards him. He put himself aside in order to fill out the young man. This irritated Anna. "Father," she said abruptly, "give me some collection." "What collection?" asked Brangwen. "Don't be ridiculous," she cried, flushing. "Nay," he said, "what collection's this? You know it's the first Sunday of the month." Anna stood confused. Why was he doing this? Why was he making her conspicuous before this stranger? "I want some collection," she reasserted. "So this says," he replied indifferently, looking at her, then turning again to this nephew. She went forward and thrust her hand into his breeches pocket. He smoked steadily, making no resistance, talking to his nephew. Her hand groped about in his pocket, and then drew out his leathern purse. Her color was bright in her clear cheeks, her eyes shone. Brangwen's eyes were twinkling. The nephew sat sheepishly. Anna, in her finery, sat down and slid all the money into her lap. There was silver and gold. The youth could not help watching her. She was bent over the heap of money, fingering the different coins. "I've a good mind to take half a sovereign," she said, and she looked up with glowing dark eyes. She met the light brown eyes of her cousin, close and intent upon her. She was startled. She laughed quickly and turned to her father. "I've a good mind to take half a sovereign, our dad," she said. "Yes, nimble fingers," said her father. "You take what's your own." "Are you coming, Ariana?" asked her brother from the door. She suddenly chilled to normal, forgetting both her father and her cousin. "Yes, I'm ready," she said, taking 6 pence from the heap of money and sliding the rest back into the purse, which she laid on the table. "Give it here," said her father. Hastily, she thrust the purse into his pocket and was going out. "You'd better go, lad, hadn't you?" said the father to the nephew. Well, Brangwen rose uncertainly. He had golden brown, quick, steady eyes, like a bird's, like a hawk's, which cannot look afraid. "Your cousin will come with you," said the father. Anna glanced at the strange youth again. She felt him waiting there for her to notice him. He was hovering on the edge of her consciousness, ready to come in. She did not want to look at him. She was antagonistic to him. She waited without speaking. Her cousin took his hat and joined her. It was summer outside. Her brother Fred was plucking a sprig of flowery currant to put in his coat from the bush at the angle of the house. She took no notice. Her cousin followed just behind her. They were on the high road. She was aware of a strangeness in her being. It made her uncertain. She caught sight of the flowering currant in her brother's buttonhole. "Oh, our Fred," she cried. "Don't wear that stuff to go to church." Fred looked down protectively at the pink adornment on his breast. "Why, I like it," he said. "Then you're the only one who does, I'm sure," she said. And she turned to her cousin. "Do you like the smell of it?" she asked. He was there beside her, tall and uncouth and yet self-possessed. It excited her. "I can't say whether I do or not," he replied. "Give it here, Fred. Don't have it smelling in church," she said to the little boy, her page. Her fair, small brother handed her the flower dutifully. She sniffed it and gave it without a word to her cousin, for his judgment. He smelled the dangling flower curiously. "It's a funny smell," he said. And suddenly she laughed, and a quick light came on all their faces. There was a blithe trip in the small boy's walk. The bells were ringing. They were going up the summery hill in their Sunday clothes. Anna was very fine in a silk frock of brown and white stripes, tied along the arms and the body, bunched up very elegantly behind the skirt. There was something of the cavalier about Will Brangwen, and he was well dressed. He walked along with the sprig of currant blossom dangling between his fingers, and none of them spoke. The sun shone brightly on little showers of buttercup down the bank. In the fields the fool's parsley was foamy, held very high and proud above a number of flowers that flitted in the greenish twilight of the mowing grass below. They reached the church. Fred led the way to the pew, followed by the cousin, then Anna. She felt very conspicuous and important. Somehow, this young man gave her away to other people. He stood aside and let her pass to her place, then sat next to her. It was a curious sensation to sit next to him. The color came streaming from the painted window above her. It lit on the dark wood of the pew, on the stone, worn aisle, on the pillar behind her cousin, and on her cousin's hands as they lay on his knees. She sat amid illumination and luminous shadow all around her, her soul very bright. She sat, without knowing it, conscious of the hands and motionless knees of her cousin. Something strange had entered into her world, something entirely strange and unlike what she knew. She was curiously elated. She sat in a glowing world of unreality, very delightful. A brooding light, like laughter, was in her eyes. She was aware of a strange influence entering into her, which she enjoyed. It was a dark, enriching influence she had not known before. She did not think of her cousin, but she was startled when his hands moved. She wished he would not say the responses so plainly. It diverted her from her vague enjoyment. Why would he obtrude and draw notice to himself? It was bad taste. But she went on all right till the hymn came. He stood up beside her to sing, and that pleased her. Then suddenly, at the very first word, his voice came strong and overriding, filling the church. He was singing the tenor. Her soul opened in amazement. His voice filled the church. It rang out like a trumpet and rang out again. She started to giggle over her hymn book, but he went on perfectly steady. Up and down rang his voice, going its own way. She was helplessly shocked into laughter. Between moments of dead silence in herself, she shook with laughter. On came the laughter, seized her, and shook her till the tears were in her eyes. She was amazed and rather enjoyed it. And still the hymn rolled on, and still she laughed. She bent over her hymn book crimson with confusion, but still her sides shook with laughter. She pretended to cough. She pretended to have a crumb in her throat. Fred was gazing up at her with clear blue eyes. She was recovering herself. And then a slur in the strong, blind voice at her side brought it all on again, in a gust of mad laughter. She bent down to prayer in cold reproof of herself. And yet, as she knelt, little eddies of giggling went over her. The very sight of his knees on the praying cushion sent the little shock of laughter over her. She gathered herself together and sat with prim, pure face, white and pink and cold as a Christmas rose, her hands and her silk gloves folded on her lap, her dark eyes all vague, abstracted in a sort of dream, oblivious of everything. The sermon rolled on vaguely, in a tide of pregnant peace. Her cousin took out his pocket handkerchief. He seemed to be drifted, absorbed into the sermon. He put his handkerchief to his face. Then something dropped onto his knee. There lay the bit of flowering currant. He was looking down at it in real astonishment. A wild snort of laughter came from Anna. Everybody heard. It was torture. He had shut the crumpled flower in his hand and was looking up again with the same absorbed attention to the sermon. Another snort of laughter from Anna. Fred nudged her remindingly. Her cousin sat motionless. Somehow he was aware that his face was red. She could feel him. His hand, closed over the flower, remained quite still, pretending to be normal. Another wild struggle in Anna's breast, and the snort of laughter. She bent forward, shaking with laughter. It was now no joke. Fred was nudging at her. She nudged him back fiercely. Then another vicious spasm of laughter seized her. She tried to ward it off in a little cough. The cough ended in a suppressed whoop. She wanted to die, and the closed hand crept away to the pocket. Whilst she sat in taut suspense, the laughter rushed back at her, knowing he was fumbling in his pocket to shove the flower away. In the end, she felt weak, exhausted, and thoroughly depressed. A blankness of wincing depression came over her. She hated the presence of the other people. Her face became quite haughty. She was unaware of her cousin anymore. When the collection arrived with the last hymn, her cousin was again singing resoundingly. And still it amused her. In spite of the shameful exhibition she had made of herself, it amused her still. She listened to it in a spell of amusement. And the bag was thrust in front of her, and her sixpence was mingled in the folds of her glove. In her haste to get it out, it flipped away and went twinkling in the next pew. She stood and giggled. She could not help it. She laughed outright, a figure of shame. "What were you laughing about, Ariana?" asked Fred, the moment they were out of the church. "Oh, I couldn't help it," she said, in her careless, half-mocking fashion. "I don't know why Cousin Will's singing set me off." "What was there in my singing to make you laugh?" he asked.
"It was so loud," she said.
They did not look at each other, but they both laughed again, both reddening. "What were you snorting and laughing for, Ariana?" asked Tom, the elder brother, at the dinner table, his hazel eyes bright with joy. Everybody stopped to look at you. Tom was in the choir. She was aware of Will's eyes shining steadily upon her, waiting for her to speak. "It was Cousin Will singing," she said. at which her cousin burst into a suppressed, chuckling laugh, suddenly showing all his small, regular, rather sharp teeth, and just as quickly closing his mouth again. "Has he got such a remarkable voice on him then?" asked Brangwen. "No, it's not that," said Anna. "Only it tickled me. I couldn't tell you why." And again a ripple of laughter went down the table, while Brangwen thrust forward his dark face,